The receipt trembles slightly in his hand, not because the apartment is cold, not because the lights are flickering, not because some dramatic catastrophe has already arrived at the door, but because somewhere, deep inside the human nervous system, ancient instincts are beginning to recognize danger before the conscious mind can explain it. A father sits silently at a kitchen table, illuminated only by the pale glow of a refrigerator light leaking into the room from behind him. Outside the apartment window, the city still shines with confidence. Cars move through rain-covered streets in smooth rivers of red and white light. Restaurants remain crowded. Delivery drivers weave between intersections, carrying overpriced meals to people watching financial podcasts about building wealth and future opportunities. Inside airport terminals across the world, giant screens continue displaying green stock, market numbers climbing upward as if prosperity itself has become permanent. Civilization appears healthy, stable, untouchable. And yet, sitting across from him, his daughter asks a question, so small it almost disappears into the ordinary sounds of the evening. Why is the cereal more expensive again? He looks down at the receipt. Bread, milk, eggs, rice, cooking. Oil. Every item slightly higher than last month. Not enough to trigger panic. Not enough to trigger panic. Not enough for emergency broadcasts or collapsing skyscrapers or screaming television anchors warning about economic catastrophe. Just enough to create a quiet fracture in perception. Subtle feeling that reality itself is beginning to drift sideways. And that is how hyperinflation usually begins. Not with explosions, not with riots, not with empty supermarket shelves or burning cities, but with confusion, with subtle disbelief, with ordinary people sensing that the numbers around them are changing faster than their minds can emotionally process. History hides a deeply uncomfortable truth about monetary collapse. Societies often appear wealthiest moments before their currencies begin dying. The lights remain on, cafes remain crowded. Politicians continue smiling behind podiums. Economists appear on television calmly explaining why inflation is temporary and under control. Human psychology is designed to assume tomorrow will resemble yesterday. That assumption becomes dangerous during the final stages of debt-based civilizations. Because by the time the average person recognizes hyperinflation clearly, protection usually becomes almost impossible. In Weimar, hyperinflation, ordinary citizens initially believed rising prices were temporary disruptions caused by post-war instability. In Venezuela, families assumed shortages would stabilize within months once political conditions improved. In nearly every historical collapse, populations trusted institutions until the very moment. Trust itself evaporated beneath their feet, and when confidence finally breaks, reality accelerates faster than human beings can psychologically adapt. Because inflation does not merely destroy savings, it rewires human behavior. The first thing hyperinflation truly destroys is not wealth. It is time. People stop planning in years and begin planning in weeks, then days, then hours. Workers rush to spend wages immediately before prices rise again. Families begin stockpiling necessities instead of imagining futures. Long-term thinking disappears because survival becomes immediate. Money transforms psychologically from stored labor into something radioactive, something people want to escape as quickly as possible. And once society reaches that stage, everything changes. Neighbors slowly become competitors. Trust weakens communities. Fracture under invisible pressure. The social contract that quietly held civilization together begins dissolving molecule by molecule. That is the terrifying paradox of hyperinflation. The more governments print money to stabilize society, the more unstable society becomes, like firefighters spraying gasoline onto a burning building. Every intervention designed to restore confidence often weakens. Confidence further beneath the surface, because hidden underneath modern civilization exists a truth few people ever examine closely. The global financial system survives almost entirely on belief. Paper currency has no intrinsic value. Digital numbers inside bank accounts are not wealth themselves. They are symbols representing collective faith that tomorrow, strangers will continue accepting them in exchange for food, fuel, medicine, electricity, and survival. Money works because populations believe it works. But what happens when that belief begins cracking? What happens when millions of people slowly realize the system requires endless money creation simply to remain operational? Modern economies no longer function like traditional productive systems alone. They function like giant debt machines requiring perpetual expansion to avoid collapse. Governments borrow more to maintain growth. Central banks create liquidity to prevent recession. Financial markets rise higher and higher, not necessarily because societies are becoming healthier, but because new currency continues flooding. The system like artificial oxygen keeping a patient alive, and for a while, it feels normal. The illusion continues until suddenly it doesn't. That is why protecting a family during hyperinflation is not merely about buying gold or storing cash or learning investment strategies. It is about preserving stability while the psychological foundations of society begin shifting beneath everyone around you. Because the greatest danger during monetary collapse is rarely absolute poverty at first. It is panic. Panic spreads faster than inflation itself. Panic empties supermarket shelves before shortages technically exist. Panic turns rational people into desperate animals operating entirely on fear. Panic transforms modern cities into emotional pressure cookers, where millions suddenly realize that systems they trusted may no longer protect them. And perhaps the darkest part of all this, most societies never recognize hyperinflation while it is approaching. They recognize it only after daily life becomes governed by survival. Tonight, supermarket shelves remain full because millions still trust tomorrow. They still trust banks. They still trust governments. They still trust the idea that stability is permanent because it has existed for most of their lives. But history whispers something deeply unsettling beneath the noise of modern civilization. Every empire once believed its system would last forever. Every collapsing currency once looked stable in the beginning. And somewhere tonight, another father is staring silently at another grocery receipt, feeling something invisible beginning to break long before the rest of society notices it at all. Long before digital banking, before stock markets glowed across giant electronic screens, before governments could create trillions of dollars with a few keystrokes, civilizations discovered something dangerously seductive hidden inside: money itself, the ability to delay collapse by quietly altering reality. History reveals that hyperinflation is not a modern accident. It is an ancient human pattern, a recurring cycle that appears whenever empires accumulate too much debt, too many promises, and too much political pressure to tell populations the truth. And almost every time, it begins the same way, not with panic, but with gradual denial. In the final centuries of the Roman Empire, emperors faced an impossible problem. Military campaigns had become expensive. Borders stretched too wide. Political instability grew more violent with every passing decade. The empire needed more money than it could honestly generate through taxation and production. So Rome chose a quieter solution. It began diluting its silver coins. At first, the changes were subtle. Citizens still held coins stamped with imperial authority. Caesar's face still stared back at them. Markets continued functioning. Life appeared normal on the surface. But beneath that illusion, something profound had changed. The actual silver content inside Roman currency kept shrinking. More coins entered circulation, carrying less real value. And slowly, trust in the monetary system began eroding from within the empire itself. That is one of history's darkest paradoxes. Empires rarely collapse because they run out of soldiers. First, they collapse because they run out of trustworthy money. The Roman government did not intend to destroy civilization. It simply attempted to survive another year, another war, another crisis. Currency debasement became a temporary solution, repeated over and over until temporary measures evolved into permanent deterioration. Later, humanity repeated the exact same pattern. During the French Revolution, revolutionary leaders inherited a nation buried under debt and instability. To stabilize the economy, they introduced paper currency known as assignats, supposedly backed by confiscated church lands. Initially, the experiment seemed miraculous. Economic activity surged. Liquidity expanded. Citizens felt hopeful again. Politicians celebrated the new financial flexibility as proof the revolution was working. But hidden beneath the optimism was a dangerous temptation. If printing money solved problems once, why not print more? And so they did, again and again. At first, The inflation felt manageable. Then prices accelerated. Bread became increasingly expensive. Workers demanded higher wages. Merchants hoarded goods. Citizens began losing faith in the currency faster than authorities could restore confidence. Soon, the assignat collapsed almost entirely. What began as a tool for economic stabilization transformed into a machine consuming the purchasing power of ordinary people. And yet, perhaps, no event in modern history captures the psychological horror of hyperinflation more vividly than Weimar hyperinflation. Germany, after World War I, was financially shattered. Reparations burdened the economy. Political instability poisoned national confidence. The government responded by printing enormous quantities of money to manage obligations and maintain social order. Initially, most citizens remained calm. That is what makes hyperinflation so deceptive. The early stages often feel survivable. Prices rise slowly at first. Experts insist conditions are temporary. Governments reassure the public repeatedly. Life continues functioning just enough to preserve the illusion of control. Then suddenly, acceleration begins. Workers in Weimar Germany were paid multiple times per day because wages lost value within hours. Families rushed from factories to stores before prices changed again by evening. Children played with stacks of banknotes because currency had become cheaper than toys. One famous story described a woman pushing a wheelbarrow full of money through the street. When she briefly turned away, thieves stole the wheelbarrow, but left the cash behind. Think about what that means psychologically. Imagine spending decades building savings through discipline and sacrifice, only to discover your life's work can no longer purchase basic survival. The middle class suffered the deepest psychological wound. The wealthy often escaped through assets. The poor already understood hardship, but ordinary savers, teachers, engineers, shop owners, office workers watched their financial identities evaporate almost overnight. And once trust disappeared, society itself began changing shape. Neighbors stopped cooperating. Businesses manipulated prices constantly. Fear replaced planning. The future became impossible to imagine because the present consumed all mental energy. Yet, humanity still learned nothing permanent from Weimar. Decades later, Zimbabwe experienced one of the worst hyperinflationary episodes in modern history. Prices doubled at incomprehensible speeds. Citizens carried bags filled with banknotes just to buy groceries. Some stores stopped printing price labels entirely because numbers changed too quickly. Meanwhile, in Argentina, recurring inflationary crises became so normalized that entire generations grew up instinctively distrusting long-term savings and national currency stability. Even post-Soviet economies witnessed similar patterns. Stable professionals suddenly found themselves unable to afford necessities as monetary systems collapsed faster than society could emotionally adapt. And perhaps the most haunting pattern connecting every hyperinflationary society is this. Almost nobody believed collapse was possible beforehand. Citizens trusted institutions because institutions had always existed. Banks looked permanent. Governments appeared stable. Currency felt eternal simply because most people had never personally witnessed its disappearance. But money is not truly paper. It is collective belief, and belief is fragile. Civilizations operate on invisible assumptions people rarely question until those assumptions begin breaking apart. The moment populations lose confidence that tomorrow's currency will retain value, panic begins accelerating the collapse itself. That is why hyperinflation behaves less like ordinary economics and more like mass psychological contagion. Savings disappear first, then pensions, then salaries, eventually. Even time itself becomes unstable because prices move too rapidly for normal planning. Parents stop dreaming about their children as futures and begin obsessing over next week's groceries. Long-term civilization collapses into short-term survival. The most disturbing realization of all may be this. Every historical collapse looked temporary while it was happening. Every society believed its institutions were uniquely modern, uniquely resilient, uniquely immune from the mistakes of the past, until, suddenly, they weren't. Modern money is one of the strangest psychological inventions ever created. Entire civilizations wake up every morning, leave their homes, sit in traffic, sacrifice time, energy, youth, and health, all in exchange for symbols, Numbers? On screens, paper backed by promises. Digital entries. Floating silently through invisible banking systems. Most people will never truly understand, and yet those abstractions determine where families live, what they eat, how they survive, and whether they feel secure about tomorrow. That is the hidden architecture. Beneath modern civilization, fiat currency, money with no intrinsic value beyond collective agreement, for most of human history, currency was connected to something tangible: silverland, physical commodities. But modern fiat systems operate differently. Their power comes from confidence, taxation, government authority, and the assumption that tomorrow strangers will continue accepting the currency exactly as they do today, which creates a deeply unsettling paradox. Modern economies require perpetual inflation to survive. Most people believe inflation is a flaw inside the system. In reality, the system was designed around it. Without expanding debt and currency supply, modern economies begin suffocating beneath their own obligations. Businesses slow down, credit contracts, asset prices weaken. Governments struggle financing enormous promises built upon future growth. Assumptions. The entire structure resembles a gigantic skyscraper balanced on invisible scaffolding from the outside. It looks permanent, solid, untouchable, but underneath, constant maintenance is required to stop collapse. Every recession demands intervention. Every market crash triggers emergency responses. Every financial shock requires liquidity injections, stimulus packages, bailouts, or central bank expansion. And because global debt levels have reached extraordinary heights, governments increasingly face an impossible choice whenever instability appears: allow painful collapse or print more money. Historically, civilizations almost always choose printing, not necessarily because leaders are evil, but because deflationary. Collapse is politically unbearable. Mass unemployment destroys governments. Banking failures trigger panic. Economic depression creates riots, instability, and social rage. Politicians, therefore, prioritize short-term stability over long-term currency health, because survival inside political systems depends on immediate public perception. So central banks intervene repeatedly, injecting liquidity into markets like emergency oxygen, keeping a fragile patient alive, and for a while, the medicine appears effective. Markets recover, consumers continue spending, asset prices rise, confidence returns, but hidden underneath those interventions lies a dangerous consequence. The more authorities rescue the system, the more dependent the system becomes on rescue, like a body developing addiction to stronger doses of medicine. Financial systems gradually require larger and larger interventions to maintain the same level of stability. This is why central banks often resemble firefighters using gasoline. Interest rates rise to fight inflation. But higher interest rates also threaten debt-heavy economies, drowning beneath mortgages, government obligations, corporate loans, and consumer credit. Higher rates slow borrowing, weaken markets, and risk recession. So eventually authorities reverse course again. More liquidity enters the system, more currency gets created, more debt accumulates, and each cycle postpones collapse temporarily while enlarging the scale of future instability. That is the hidden engine. Beneath modern monetary systems, growth is no longer optional. It is required for survival. But infinite growth inside a finite reality creates mathematical tension that cannot expand forever without consequences. Most ordinary people experience inflation only through symptoms: more expensive groceries, higher rent, rising fuel costs. But inflation is far more profound than rising prices. Alone, inflation is silent wealth transfer. Every new currency unit entering circulation reduces the purchasing power of currency already existing within the system, which means inflation quietly transfers value from savers to debtors, from wage earners to asset holders, and from the future into the present. Land.tools, food networks, adaptability, productive assets in collapsing societies. These forms of stability often become more valuable than abstract financial wealth itself, because hyperinflation eventually forces populations to rediscover an uncomfortable truth modern civilization tries to ignore. Real wealth is not paper, it is usefulness. A farmer growing food possesses value. A mechanic repairing machines possesses value. Communities capable of cooperation possess value. Families capable of emotional stability during chaos possess value. Currency merely represents those things temporarily, and that realization becomes even more haunting in the digital age. Today, most money no longer physically exists at all. Exists as electronic numbers inside interconnected databases controlled by banks, governments, and financial institutions. Entire populations trust invisible digits, accessed through phones and credit cards. But what happens if trust in those digits weakens? What happens when panic spreads digitally at the speed of algorithms and social media? In previous centuries, fear traveled slowly through newspapers and rumor. Modern panic can spread across continents within minutes. A banking rumor, a currency crisis, a viral video showing empty shelves. A sudden collapse in confidence amplified through millions of interconnected screens simultaneously, which raises a terrifying possibility. Could hyperinflation accelerate faster today than at any other point in human history? Precisely because money itself has become almost entirely psychological. Because in the end, hyperinflation does not truly begin when governments print excessive money. It begins when populations lose faith that the printing will ever stop. And once that psychological threshold breaks, the system begins feeding on fear itself for most of human history. Economic collapse was local. A kingdom could fail while distant nations continued functioning normally. A currency crisis might devastate one region while another remained untouched. Geography acted like a firewall, slowing the spread of instability. But the modern world no longer functions that way. Today, the global economy resembles a giant electrical grid stretching across continents. Every nation connected through debt, markets, reserve currencies, supply chains, energy systems, shipping routes, and digital finance. One disruption no longer remains isolated. Shockwaves travel instantly through interconnected systems carrying fear from one side of the planet to the other, and hidden at the center of this vast network sits one fragile pillar supporting much of modern civilization: the US dollar.